storms. Storms come unbidden and often leave devastation in their wake. I have memories as a young child on the island of Puerto Rico of watching my dad and some of the other men in the neighborhood take large sheets of plywood. I don't know how they attached them because these were houses that were made of concrete blocks. But somehow they attached those large sheets of plywood to cover all of the glass windows in every house in our area because the hurricane was on its way. And the high velocity winds would destroy the windows and we would be subjected to all the elements. So they got ready. Just as a child, I remember feeling this sense of dread about the storm that was coming. Storms. I remember storms in north central Texas when I saw what flashed up here with the lightning and the rain. It reminded me of those dramatic electrical storms which hit the north central plains of Texas. They can roll in very suddenly. I can remember watching the storm clouds, dark and high, thunder clouds on the horizon that would soon become pounding rain, flashing lightning that could almost blind you, and a thunderclap that went right through you. Storms. Or I remember being tucked away in that little pocket of southwest Michigan named Berrien Springs. Having grown up in the tropics and in Texas, I had heard songs about winter wonderland. I had never lived it. So when I saw these large white flakes falling and becoming more intense, and soon saw the entire landscape a blinding white, I thought, it's beautiful indeed. But I wasn't quite prepared for how to live in it. Nobody told me that when I went out to my car and tried to get in, that my lock would be frozen. Couldn't get in my car. Storms. They come uninvited, unbidden, but they often leave devastation in their wake. And they're not just physical storms either. My years of gathering marriage and family therapy training hours, I remember sitting with a couple in a counseling office. They came in together, but before long he would bolt out of the room because he's turned to this woman to whom he had said, I do, and he said, I won't anymore. There's someone else, and out he went. And I remember having no idea what to do, feeling utterly helpless as this woman disintegrated. Sobs, wails, caught in the grip of a storm. Another case, I was the chaplain. I pulled up a chair. She was in the orthopedic unit, and this was way above my pay grade or my training, but there were lines connected to weights and pulleys that were connected to metal that came out of her bones, and she was being held together. I had to get very close to be able to hear her whisper. What did I do? Why is God after me? What is wrong? Storms. They are most often not fun even in the physical world. They certainly aren't fun in the relational, emotional, or political space. Storms. I wonder if you would salute, if I ran up the flagpole, a flag that said, storms are not God's purpose for you. But sometimes God's purpose lies on the other side of the storm. Storms are not God's purpose for you. He's not sending them into your life to create havoc in your world. They're not His purpose for you, but sometimes His purpose lies on the other side of the storm, meaning we have to somehow get through it. While you're considering whether or not you might accept that, I want to take us to Luke's Gospel, the 8th chapter, Luke chapter 8. That's the chapter from which we're going to read, but I honestly want to set a bit of the stage first. I want to remind you, for example, that Luke is likely a Gentile writer, and if so, likely the only Gentile writer in the New Testament. But in terms of actual words, he's written more of the New Testament than anyone else. We have to listen to Luke. But because of who he is, he paints a picture of God through his selection of the material from the life of Jesus that he will share. That is a God with a very wide, broad vision. You will find that in Luke's gospel. It gets Jesus into trouble. Another part of context is to go back here to the Nazareth synagogue, Luke chapter 4, where Jesus delivers what I would call his inaugural address, his kingdom manifesto. In that manifesto, in that address, he says God's vision, God's purpose, God's kingdom is bigger than just us. And then he uses two illustrations, both of them Gentiles, Naaman the Syrian and the widow of Zarephath, as illustrations of who will be welcomed into the kingdom of God. When he does that, there's an immediate eruption. They rush him out of town, ready to throw him off a cliff. Almost gets him killed before his mission even gets underway. But he just keeps at it in different ways, telling parables, painting pictures of God, ministering to people. He keeps talking about the fact that God's kingdom will be bigger than just us. And ultimately, that has to include the Gentiles. And then we come to Luke 8. So to set just a bit more context in Luke 8, I want to read the first 4 verses of the chapter. It gives us a sense of what it is that Jesus is doing, of who it is that is responding to what he says. Verse 1, after this, Jesus traveled about from one town and village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, and also some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out. Joanna, the wife of Chuza, the manager of Herod's household, and Susanna, and many others. These women were helping to support them out of their own means. While a large crowd was gathering and people were coming to Jesus from town after town, he told them this parable. So just from those 4 verses, notice, those being invited and those accepting the invitation into the kingdom include the 12. We already heard from them a couple of weeks ago and saw what a dramatically different kind of group they were in terms of their philosophies, their commitments, their politics, and yet they're there. They're all there. Women are there. And Luke is careful to name them because women in all the Gospels, but particularly in Luke's Gospel, will play a central role. They'll be part of the kingdom. And then he says in verse 4, he says, and crowds came from town after town. The doorway to the kingdom is open to all. The last verse we read says, and then he told them this parable. The parable he told them was the parable we call the parable of the sower, although we should call it the parable of the soils. Because it still tells the story of this farmer who goes out, as would have happened in their day, with a large bag of seed. He dips into the bag and he just throws the seed, throws it out, hoping that it will land in the furrows, hoping that it will land in good ground and sprout and bear fruit. But this sower throws it into all kinds of soils. Soils that will be responsive and those that won't. All kinds of soils. Another hint of what Jesus is doing with his kingdom. And then he follows that by talking about a light. He says, no one takes a light, lights a lamp, and then goes off and sticks it behind something so that it is hidden. No, you put it right front and center so that all can benefit from the light. Another hint of the kind of kingdom he will create. And it is right then, while he's teaching, that somebody apparently interrupts him and says, hey, your mother, your brothers are out here. They're wanting to talk to you. Now, what does any good son, any good brother do? Not what Jesus did. Because what Jesus did was that he said, let me tell you who my mother and my brothers and my sisters are. My mother, my brother, my sisters are anyone who hear the word of the kingdom, accept it, and live it. In other words, in this kingdom that I'm creating, no one has an upper edge, even by family ties. He is spreading the gospel of the kingdom very wide, pushing the boundaries back so that all might be involved. And it is at that point that today's text comes. So with all that background in place, listen to these words. Luke 8, starting in verse 22. One day Jesus said to his disciples, let us go over to the other side of the lake. So they got into a boat and set out. As they sailed, he fell asleep. A squall came down on the lake so that the boat was being swamped and they were in great danger. The disciples went and woke him saying, Master, Master, we're going to drown. He got up and rebuked the wind and the raging waters. The storm subsided and all was calm. Where's your faith? He asked the disciples. In fear and amazement, they asked one another, who is this? He commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him. You've been around the Bible long enough to know that sometimes very simple statements aren't just simple statements. In fact, they're very deep statements. Jesus says, in the context which we've just considered, Jesus says, let's go over to the other side. It's a simple statement, right? Just like this is the next step in our travel plans. I think they got good beaches over there. I think we can get some R&R over there. I think we can get away from all these crowds. Let's go over there and see what happens. That is not what this is. So you have to picture the Sea of Galilee and its location in ancient Palestine. Jesus has been ministering on the western side. On this side, his works, his sermons, his feeding, his healing, all has been happening over here. This is the Jewish side. The other side of the lake, which he names here, that's where the Decapolis is. Deca, Greek word for 10. Polis, Greek word for cities. The 10 cities. That was the Hellenized place. That was the Gentile place. In fact, in the very next story, he will have an encounter with pigs, a huge herd of pigs. They don't raise those on the Jewish side. We are definitely deeply in Gentile territory. So when Jesus says to them, let's go to the other side, that's not a travel suggestion. That is a deep mission statement that has already almost cost him his life. And he says, let's go to the other side. Because there is a world over there that I need to begin to speak into, to touch. I need to begin to share with them the message of the kind of God that loves them equally. Let's go to the other side. And so they clamber into the boat with him and set out. And then the storm erupts. Now, it's tempting to say, well, it's a storm, okay. In fact, the NIV calls it a squall. That doesn't sound like much, even though in Mark it's a furious squall. But don't be deceived by that. Listen to these words from New Testament scholar Clinton Arnold, who is one of many who describe the very same thing at different levels of language and intensity. Arnold writes, the Sea of Galilee, lying in a basin 700 feet below sea level and surrounded by mountains, is particularly susceptible to sudden violent storms. With two large valleys open on the west, Wadi Haman and the Beit Netofa Valley, cold westerly winds can descend quickly, turning the placid lake into a raging sea with waves up to 7 feet. In the winter, sudden easterly winds can blow up to 6 or 7 foot waves. Luke is not exaggerating when he says the disciples are in great danger. It's an intense storm. Another hint of that is the fact that the disciples include members, maybe half of them, who are fishermen who have spent their lives on this lake, who know exactly what happens, how to handle the storms. They've likely ridden out countless storms on these very waters. This one is so intense that even they are screaming out, "We're going to drown. We're going down. Wake him up." They're on their way to do mission. God's purpose lies on the other side, and the storm descends with intensity and fury. A second thing we have to notice about this storm is that in the minds of the men on the water, in the minds of their world, this was much more than just a physical storm. There are so many places to which we could look, but I'll give you just one brief one from one Bible dictionary. The Hebrews betrayed little interest in or enthusiasm for the sea. Probably their fear of the ocean stemmed from the ancient Semitic belief that the deep personified the power that fought against the deity. In other words, for them, the deep, what was down there was darkness, was evil, was demons, was the devil. That was where it emerged from. It was from the chaos of the sea. So when they're fighting for their lives on this boat that is being tossed in every direction, they are not just fighting to survive physically, which they are, but it is as though the spiny, bloodless hand of evil is reaching up to grasp their craft and to plunge it into the depths. They're doubtless doing everything possible to keep the boat afloat. And Jesus is asleep. 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 I haven't been on a storm at sea. Closest I've been is some rough waters off the coast of San Diego when we went whale watching. I fed the fish a lot more than I saw the fish. It was a rough outing. I don't know what I would do if I was on a storm at sea. Panic? Pray? Bail over the side? Do something else over the side? I don't know what I would do. But I can guarantee you there is one thing I would not be doing if the boat is about to go down. I would not be asleep. They're screaming, "Fishermen, we're going down." Jesus sleeps. What? It's crazy. Sorry, I don't mean disrespect to Jesus. That's crazy. How do you sleep in the middle of the storm that's going on? Now, because of how they understood the storm, I want you to do a little bit of C.S. Lewis with me. C.S. Lewis would write things from the dark side to help us picture that world. So I want you to imagine from the dark side what the posture is. It's as though the forces of evil are talking together saying, "You see what he's doing? You see what he's done on the west side of the lake? how he's changing people's lives. Their world will never be the same again. Now he's headed to the east side of the lake. Now he's going to step into Gentile territory. If he gets a foothold, if he gets a hand in the door in that territory with the kind of God he preaches, it's all over. We will no longer be fighting a contained battle on this side of the lake. We'll be dealing with potentially the entire world. So stop that boat. Sink that boat. Do not allow that boat to get to the other side. It cannot. And Jesus sleeps. Now, when they do awaken him, when he does get up, he does something curious. Pardon me. Luke is very clear in his wording. When he woke up, it says he got up and rebuked the wind and the waves. Rebuked. It's a very intentionally chosen word. It's the same word he will use in the next story when he faces the demons. New Testament scholar Fred Craddock says, what Jesus does on the sea is an exorcism. Speaking to evil, he rebukes it. Just as he does with the demon possessed when he rebukes the demon and says, come out. Thus he says to the sea, no doubt grounded in their understandings of what was happening. The suggestion was the storm is not God's purpose for you. That storm in which you find yourself right now, that relational storm, that political storm, that professional storm, it is not God's purpose for you. But God's purpose just may be on the other side of that storm, meaning you have to get through the storm. The story says, a couple of ways you can try that. Scream and yell and cry out in panic. Fight with all of your might to try to stay alive, try to stay afloat in the middle of the storm. Or trust the one who's asleep. I want to tell you a story. It's a story to the best of my recollection that I've never told in public, rarely even in private. Shared it for the first time this morning in first service. It's a story that is deeply meaningful and important to me because without what happened in this story, I would not be here. I've not told it, and I tell it with some hesitation. I've gone back and forth all week. But the more I read this story, the more I thought maybe it fits. I have reservations because there is what I can only consider to be a miraculous element in it, without which I wouldn't be here. And yet I am keenly aware that when the storm blows in many of our lives, that doesn't happen. So it makes me very careful to say this. But ultimately I chose to. So some background. Background was that in the South American country of Colombia, on April 9, 1948, a political leader was assassinated. That assassination set off El Bogotazo, happening in the city of Bogotá, which years later would become the city of my birth. El Bogotazo. There had long been tensions and fighting between liberals and conservatives. Solomon said there's nothing new under the sun. Between liberals and conservatives fighting. And then just to make sure it could be boiled into a raging cauldron, they just poured in a little bit of religion with Protestants and Catholics. But almost any source I've been able to find says at the core, it was a political battle. So when that political leader was assassinated, the city erupted. 10 hours, April 9, 1948, El Bogotazo. By the end of those 10 hours, downtown Bogota was a smoldering ruin with between 2,000 and 5,000 people dead. That then set off something called La Violencia, the violence, which would be a decade of fighting and killing. That by the end of it would leave about 200,000 people dead and about 1 million displaced. It was particularly intense outside of the cities, into the rural and the mountain areas. I was texting this week with my siblings, trying to make sure I remembered things right. Was reading about it. Something interesting emerged. The sources say that 1952 was probably the most intense that it got. 1952 has meaning to us because that was the year Bob and Betty Roberts, my mom and dad, landed in Bogota. Landed there to share the message of Jesus with people who might want to hear about his kingdom. Right in the middle of La Violencia. Many stories emerged from that. But one just a bit later, Dad, who was always interested in pushing the boundary of the kingdom wider and inviting more in, had agreed to go out to a mountainous area. That was the really dangerous area. Agreed to go out to a mountainous area. Share the word with people, some of whom had already accepted Jesus, others who were wanting to hear about his love. Meant a bumpy, long bus ride into the mountains, at the end of which there was a man that met him there, riding a horse with a horse for Dad, and off they rode down a trail for another several hours till they finally arrived at a small town. To the best of our recollection, it was the town of Peque, Colombia. He began to meet with people. There was excitement. Jesus was becoming real. But in a small town, in that day and time, particularly when Dad kind of stood out from the crowd, 6'2", 6'3", the word got out quickly, and the anger began to rise. He hadn't been there long when his host said, "You got to get out. You got to go back. It's way too dangerous." They agreed, okay, the next morning you'll head back to Medellin. Next morning, when that afternoon a group of men came around pounding on the doors, taking away everyone's horses, everyone's mules, donkeys even, taking them away. We have a mission we've got to take care of, and we need horses for people to ride. The man with whom Dad was staying, his family's small house, managed to secrete, get this, a horse in the back bedroom so that Dad could get out the next morning. Early morning, he set off. You know the trail. It's right down here. Give him his head. It's just one trail. You'll get you to the bus stop. Dad would later describe riding down that trail, the early, crisp mountain air. Came to a wooden bridge that they had crossed on the way there. Horse walked across the bridge, and he said that clip, clop of that horse on that wooden bridge just seemed to echo through every bit of space. He thought, if anyone is looking for me, this is like a bullhorn saying, here he is. But nothing happened. Kept riding. Finally arrived back at the head of the trail, the bus stop, got on the bus, made it back home. All was well. A month or two passed. Somebody came in from that town into Medellin, one of those people with whom he had studied Scripture. They said to him, Pastor Roberts, permítame preguntarle, ¿cómo regresó usted a Medellin? In other words, Pastor Roberts, let me ask you, how did you get back here to Medellin, to the bus stop? And Dad told him, I rode the same way. Man said, no lo puedo creer. I can't believe it. That group, those men going on that mission, their mission had one purpose, and that was kill you. Not allow you to get back alive. They went out and hid under that bridge you rode across all night and most of the next day, and finally returned and said he never came this way. I don't know how he got back. That story had a profound impact on me in my younger years, because I was keenly aware I wouldn't be here were it not for what happened there. A storm blowing of which I was totally unaware. Even Dad was unaware. I don't know all the answers. I can't pretend to tell you why in one place, at one time, in the midst of a storm, this person's life was preserved, while others will need to wait for the kingdom to have life. I don't know. But I do know this. I do know that when we're here and God's purpose is here, between the two, there are often storms. Storms that at times will threaten everything about us. And we will have a couple of choices. We can fight and scream and be filled with fear, as were the disciples. Or we can try to figure out how in the world Jesus could sleep. How did he sleep? How was he at peace in the midst of the storm? I wish Luke had footnotes. This is how he was at peace. This is the reason. This is why. He doesn't. He just tells us that when Jesus got up, he performed an exorcism. And they arrived safely on the other side. I did notice this week. I noticed that while Luke doesn't give us an answer, John may give us an answer. Because if you go over to John's gospel, and if you look at the last night before his crucifixion, there's a significant amount of material which Jesus shares with his disciples. He opens his heart to them. Covers about chapters 12 through 17. It's a long section. But chapter 17 is just his prayers, just his high priestly prayer. He's no longer talking just to the disciples. He's now praying to the Father. The last thing he says to his disciples, John 16:33, the last thing he says to them that night may shed light on how he slept. Because this is what he says in John 16:33. He says, "In the world you will have trouble." In other words, in the world you will face storms. But in me you will have peace. In the world, trouble, storms. In me, peace. And he gives us a reason why. He says, "Take heart, because I have overcome the world. I have conquered the storms. I have overcome evil." And I got to thinking, think of the last time you faced a huge hurdle, a mountain, something you had to face in order to get through to God's purpose on the other side. It may have been something fairly simple. It may have been a test. It may have been boards. It may have been, I don't know what it was, but something that had to be conquered, and you overcame it. When you overcame it, if you're anything like me, there was a sense of such relief and such peace. That's the message that Jesus gives in John 16. In the world, trouble. In me, peace. Take heart. I have overcome the world and the storms in it. When you realize that, you realize why he slept, when there is no challenge that you cannot or have not overcome, you can sleep in the middle of the storm. So I just ask Jesus in my own heart and life for that kind of trust in his storm-defeating power. Because since he has overcome and sleeps, he offers me his victory and allows me to rest even in the storm.